Good evening. I hope I am audible to all of you. Please make sure you can hear me clearly. So, CA Intermediate Crash Course, Group 1. Already you had a session on corporate law, and also you had a session on direct tax. And now we are here to review a later area, that is your other law. So, speaking about other law, the new syllabus, as per new syllabus, we have 3 chapters in this other law part. First one being General Clauses Act, second one being Interpretation of Statutes, and third one being Foreign Exchange Management Act. So, for today's session, I have selected this topic, Interpretation of Statutes. I'll be discussing on this particular chapter purely from examination perspective, and that too from ICAI expectation. What is the exactly the expectation of ICAI, and how are we supposed to deal with this particular chapter? So my recommendation would be, it is better if you people use ICAI material itself, or while you sit for this particular revision classes. And as far as I have seen students getting into this particular paper, based on my observations, what students are doing is that students have been skipping these 2 chapters, especially Interpretation of Statutes and General Clauses Act, probably, which is not a right thing to do, because attempt after attempt, institute is preparing its question paper in such a way that in every question they are keeping this as a one of the important question. That means where in every sub questions whatever we have, there will be one question based on either Interpretation of Statutes or General Clauses Act. So normally students tend to ignore this, and what happens is when it comes to the total marks, probably they fall short because of these questions. Maybe they might have not prepared well, or they might be they are not approaching these particular chapters in the right way. So what I advise is, see, you calculate it very clearly. Let us understand the calculations very clearly. We have 3 chapters from other law, 30 marks. So that means these are sure shot 30 marks questions that we are going to approach for. Sure shot 30 marks in the sense, some part will be in your MCQs and other parts will be in your descriptive part. So if you prepare for these 3 papers thoroughly, that too from ICAI module, what happens is you can be 100% sure that you will be scoring full marks, 30 out of 30 from this particular area. So then you can definitely have the in corporate law, there are certain areas which are repeatedly asked areas, or there are some areas where you can expect more number of questions, or where you can approach it in a better way. So probably thinking from that particular angle, I feel that uh, scoring chances, especially scoring up to 60 plus marks, whatever is there, that becomes much easier, because you get a question, or you get this particular comfort zone when it comes to this other law area, because very limited type of questions that can be asked, and that too from ICAI module only. And second thing is LLP Act, probably based on our segregation. Of course, it is not institute segregation, our segregation, that is at Trisha, how we plan is that LLP, we normally take it up along with other law itself. So limited liability partnership, if you consider, it comes for around 10 marks. So 10 plus 30, 40 marks are readily available in your hands, and 60 marks you can take it up from the corporate law part. So what I feel is, these are the chapters which you have to focus first, and you have to complete them first. So I am keeping the discussions very limited, that too from ICAI module only. Yes. So before I get into this particular ICAI module discussion, what I want to do is, I want to get you through, I want to make you run through the previous question papers that have been asked by the that have been drafted by ICAI and questions that have been asked from this particular chapter, interpretation of statutes. What type of questions we are going to expect from this chapter? So what is there on your screen are questions that have been asked in the past examinations from this particular chapter, interpretation of statutes. Why I am showing this is because, as I always keep on saying in my class, students should always know what exactly the exams they are going to write. Unnecessarily mugging up things, unnecessarily feeding the brain with so many topics will not help them crack these particular competitive examinations. Smart work is what we are supposed to do. In hard work time is already over. Hard work time is over. Probably while classes are going on, you were made to sit for hour-long classes. You were given continuous classes. So that was what all about hard work. So now it is time for smart work. So when it comes to smart work, probably we should understand which battlefield we are going to deal with. Which battlefield are we going? So once we know the particular surroundings of that particular battlefield, we can prepare well to get into that particular field. So first, I want you to glance through the questions that have been asked for past probably 6 to 7 attempts. I have a compilation of questions that have been asked by Institute for past 6 to 7 attempts, which can help you out to get an idea of what type of questions we can expect from these areas. So you see there, interpretation of statutes. The very first question is, write a short note on proviso. See, when I say write a short note on proviso with reference to rule of interpretation, this is a question based on internal aid of construction. It is a question based on internal aid of construction. You can make it out. So that means a straightforward area in internal aids of construction, we have certain points. If you write that certain points, it is over. So very, very limited, a very, very easy type of question here. Second one, associate words to be understood in the common sense manner. Probably this is a rule that has been derived from nocitar associate. They are asking us to explain this statement with reference to interpretation of statutes. Again, they are asking us to write the content of nocitar associate. Then, Sohail, a director of a company not being personally concerned or interested, financially or otherwise, in a matter of a proposed motion placed before the board meeting, did not disclose his interest, although he has knowledge that his sister is interested in that proposal. He restrains from making any disclosure of his interest on the presumption that he is not required by law to disclose any interest as he is not personally interested or concerned in the proposal. He made his presumption relying on the rule of literal construction. Explain the scope of interpretation under this rule. We already know this. This is purely based on reasonable construction. So we have an example given in ICAI material only, correct? Section 102. We have an example given in the ICAI material only. So we have to go by that particular interpretation. So whatever the content is there in ICAI material, same content is what the expectation of this answer also. So again, sorry, not reasonable construction, literal construction only, same thing. Again, if you see the answer, they have ditto copied whatever is there in ICAI material as it is. So same thing is expected by institute as the answer for this particular question based on literal interpretation. Disclosure of interest. We have an example in ICAI material for this particular area. Then, what is external aid to interpretation? Explain how dictionary definitions are the external aids to interpretation. So again, a question from external aids of construction is being asked in the past examination. Then explain mischief rule, the rule in Hayden's case for interpretation of statutes. Also give 4 matters it considers in construing an act. So that is what 4 questions are there no, in Hayden's rule. Those 4 questions is what institute is expecting you to write. Next, in what way are following terms considered as external aid of interpretation of statutes? Historical setting, use of foreign decisions. So again, straightforward theoretical area. So these are few questions which you can expect. So it's not just these many questions, all questions are there. But if you see all type of questions, these are purely based on the contents of ICAI material. Institute is not deviating anything, and institute has already clarified in their particular skill set requirement for this particular paper, they have said these questions will be questions from these chapters will be purely based on knowledge and not on application. We are not going to expect any application based questions here. It is going to be purely knowledge based questions. When they say purely knowledge based questions, we should remember that institute's expectation will be that students will be reproducing whatever is there in ICA material. So all we need to do is we need to identify the areas which can form the part of our answer when a question is asked from this particular chapter. So for the discussion, convenience of the discussion, we can divide the particular chapter into 4 categories. Mainly rules of interpretation. Rules of interpretation can be further divided into 2 categories, primary rules and secondary rules. Second one is aids to interpretation. Again, 2 categories, internal aids, external aids. Rules of interpretation of deeds and documents. And they are also giving us introduction of relevant terms. Like this 4 areas is what I feel institute can test in this particular chapter. First, I'll cover this aids of interpretation, aids to interpretation area, whatever is there. I'll try to cover that area first. Then I'll proceed for the rules of interpretation so that reference becomes easy. So in aids to interpretation, we have 2 sets, internal aids, external aids. So internal aids means something that I can pick up from the material itself, or something I can take up from the enactment itself, something that can be available, something that is available for me in the act itself for the sake of interpretation. That is what is called as internal aids of construction. That is what we call as internal aids of construction. If you can see here the chart, in the internal aids of construction, what are there? Long title, preamble, heading, marginal definition section, illustration, proviso, explanation, schedules, reading the statute as a whole. Now coming to the long title, you should always remember long title is for the identification of the enactment. Long title is the identity that gives me the identity here. See, they have given us the full title of Supreme Court Advocates Practice in High Court Act. Specify that this is an act to authorize advocates of Supreme Court to practice as of right in any high court. Now you see, this is the long title of the act. This is the long title of the act. An act to authorize advocates of Supreme Court to practice as of right in any high court. That means this act gives the right to Supreme Court advocates to practice in any high court. This particular act is giving. Because of this act, they are getting this right. So that is the long title. So you see there, if you the keyword for this particular thing, the short title merely identifies, it gives you the identity of the act, whereas long title describes the act. This is the keyword here you have to remember. Long title describes the act, short title identifies the act. So short title is how you call the act. Companies Act, Securities Exchange Board of India Act, Foreign Exchange Management India Act. These are short titles. The overall objective, why the act has been brought into force, is described using long title. We come across this thing called as long title. So this can be the first point in your answer whenever you write the answer for long title. Long title is used for describing the enactment. First point. Second point is, it is a long title is a part of the act. Long title is a part of the act, because when it comes to internal aid of construction, some internal aids are part of the act, some internal aids are not the part of the act. So writing that point also carries a weightage. Long title of an act is a part of the act. Because of that, what will happen? Third one, we can refer to it to ascertain the object, scope, and purpose of the act. Object, scope, and purpose. 3 points. Third point, we can use it to ascertain, refer to it to ascertain the object, scope, and purpose of the act. These are the 3 points that you have to remember when it comes to long title. So these are the 3 important points. You can give this example also in your answer that adds weightage for your answer, that adds special weightage for your answer. So this is about long title. Moving on further, what we have is preamble. See, preamble is also a long title. Preamble is kind of long title only. But the thing is, preamble sometimes carries weightage, sometimes doesn't carry weightage. So it depends on the circumstance, and we should also give reference to certain case laws here. So you see here, again, scope, object, purpose. Here also scope, object, purpose only. Same words, but when it comes to preamble also, you are going to write the same thing. Comprehensively than long title. Only thing, comprehensively means more wider, in a more wider way. So first point is the preamble expresses scope, object, and purpose of the act more comprehensively than long title. Second thing, preamble may recite the ground and cause of making a statute and the evil which is sought to be remedied. This can also be a second point because it is interesting line there. They are clearly saying it recites the ground and cause of making the act. Why this act has been brought into force and what was the evil? Evil means what was the problem? That is getting resorted or that is getting solved, that is getting remedied because of this particular preamble. See the wordings that institute use. It is all about remembering these wordings, nothing else, sir. It is all about remembering these words. Probably what you have to do is you need to shorten these things and write it in your notes, and you should be repeatedly reading it. So that whenever I say preamble, your mind should ponder on these words and you should be repeatedly in a position to reproduce these words. It's all about by hearting. I agree. Because when it comes to law papers, you always say that it's more of application, sir. We should not by heart things. Then you are still saying that we should by heart, but it is like the pattern is like that. In other law, majority of the things needs to be by hearted rather than understanding it. You may understand it. See, understanding is one part. Writing it in the exam is second part. Understanding one part is because you might have understood the concept thoroughly when you are sitting in the class, but the problem is reproducing it in the exam becomes a very, very important challenging area. So that is why what I'm doing is I'm making you remember those points that are very relevant and that should form the part of your answer. Preamble expresses the scope, object, purpose of the act more comprehensively than long title. Because you may ask, sir, long title also does the same thing. No, long title does it. So you have to remember the preamble of the Reserve Bank of India Act. 3 paragraphs are there. They are telling what was the problem when 1934 Reserve Bank of India Act was brought into force, what solution they wanted to bring, and through RBI, how they want to solve it. All these 3 things are given to us in the RBI Act. So what preamble does is it tells us the scope, object, and purpose, and also which evil is getting remedied because of that particular act. Then, third one. You should remember preamble of a statute is a part of the enactment and can be legitimately used for construing it. At the same time, you should also remember fourth point. What is that? Preamble does not override the plain provisions of the act, but if the wordings of the statute give rise to doubts as to proper construction, the preamble can be referred to in order to arrive at proper construction. You can ignore this part, not required. Not required, you can ignore this. Normally what they are saying is if the word is giving multiple meaning, then I should go and refer to preamble so that the word meaning is clarified. Simple. So you have to understand it. Rather, while writing the answer, what you have to write is the preamble does not override the plain provisions of the act, but if the wording of a statute give rise to doubts as to its proper construction, preamble can be referred, or you don't remember. Preamble can be referred in order to arrive at proper construction. So fifth point you can add, in short, whatever is there, the preamble to an act discloses the primary intention of the legislature, but can only be brought in as an aid to construction if the language of the statute is not clear. However, it cannot override the provisions of the enactment. That is already written, so need not repeatedly write it. Same thing, it is sufficient if you tell it once. It cannot override ante ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಮೇಲೆ ಬರೆದಿದ್ದೀರಲ್ಲ. So here it is clear. However, the preamble does not override the plain provision of the act, but if the wordings of the statute give rise to doubts as to its proper construction, preamble can be referred to in order to arrive at the proper construction. In order to arrive at the proper construction. Preamble of the act discloses the primary intention of the legislature, but can only be brought in as an aid to construction if the language of the statute is not clear. So this point, if you write, it is more than sufficient. Now, example, Galipori Saurya Raju versus Bandaru Pavani is given. Hindu Marriage Act example. That means if two people marry, one is Hindu, one is Christian, can it be covered under Hindu Marriage Act? That was the question asked before Supreme Court, and Supreme Court has clarified that going by the preamble of the Hindu Marriage Act, it says it is an act to amend and codify the law relating to marriage among the Hindus. So it says marriage between Hindu and Christian cannot be covered under Hindu Marriage Act. That clarity has been given because of the preamble. So Supreme Court has relied upon this particular preamble for interpreting the meaning of the statute. Now, heading and title of a chapter. Interesting thing is, heading and title of a chapter are not to be constructed. You are not going to consider it as a part of the act. So you see there, if we glance through any act, we find generally the number of its sections referred to in a particular subject are grouped together, sometimes in the form of chapters, prefixed by headings and or titles. So this is not required for us while writing the answer. We can simply come to here. These headings and titles prefixed to sections or group of sections can legitimately be referred to for the purpose of construing the enactment or its part. Heading and title prefixed to the sections or groups, group title or section title, whatever is there, can be legitimately be referred to for the purpose of construing the enactment or its part. Headings of different portions of a statute can be referred to determine sense of any doubtful expression in a section ranged under a particular heading. So when I say management and administration, when I get a doubt about any word that is used in that particular section, I can get to know that this particular word should be used in the context of meeting between the members, because the clarity is given in that particular heading only, management and administration. I know that whenever they discuss about management and administration, it is all about meetings of the members. Whenever they say deposits, I know all the things that are going to be discussed will be under deposits part only. So whenever the words in that particular section are ambiguous, whenever I get a doubt on that particular word, I can refer to the heading. Thereby, there will be some clarity in that particular words that are used. So this is the second point that you can keep in mind with respect to headings. Third one, they cannot control the plain meaning of the words of the enactment, though. In some cases, we looked at in the light of the preamble, if there is any ambiguity in the meaning of sections or which they can throw light. So, they cannot control the plain meaning of the words of the enactment. They cannot control the meaning because sometimes word meanings are defined in the definition section, or we can also take out the meaning from the preamble. So that is why they are saying they cannot, headings cannot control the plain meaning of the words of the enactment. It may be noted that headings may sometimes be referred to know the scope of a section in same way as the preamble, but heading cannot control or override a section. So you can make it as a fourth point. Heading may sometimes be referred to know the scope of a section in same way as preamble. See, preamble tells me the scope of entire act. Heading tells me the scope of that entire chapter. In Companies Act, 29 chapters are there. Individual chapters as a heading. Now that particular word used in that particular chapter, because of the heading, it can be interpreted. So heading tells me the scope of a particular section used in that particular chapter. But a heading cannot be, so a heading cannot control or override a section. Heading cannot control or override a section. This can be fifth point. So whenever a question is asked on heading, these 5 points can form part of your answer. Next comes marginal note. Marginal note means section title. See, remember, Institute has used certain words here, which is which gives you some doubts. Title prefix to sections is what they are saying. Titles prefixed to sections alla. Titles prefixed to chapter is what is called as heading. Heading and title prefixed to chapter. On the chapter group of sections irudu heading. Marginal note anta helidrenu. Marginal note are summaries and side notes often found at the side of a section or group of sections in act, purport to sum up the effect that sections or effect of that section. See, that side notes means normally a section will have a title like thing. If you take up the bare act, every section will have a title. That is what is called as marginal note. Now, why it is marginal note is because when the act is released, these things can be found in the margins of that particular statute. You can find them in the margins. That is why it is called as marginal note. Adakoskara ನಾನು marginal note ಅಂತ ಹೇಳ್ತೇನೆ. Marginal note are summaries and side notes often found at the side of a section. Now, margin, side, these are the key words you have to remember there. Marginal note, keys, it is found in the side. That is why they are saying at the side of a section or group of sections. So this is the first point you can include. Now, important part is, unlike any other things that we have seen in the past, they say they are not a part of the enactment. Reason, they are also telling us the reason why they are not a part of the act. They are not a part of the act because they were not present when the act was passed in the parliament, but inserted after the act has been so passed. When the act is passed in the parliament, these side notes were not there. That is why they are not to be considered as part of the act. That is why they are not aid to construction. They are not to aid to construction. But in some cases, court has relied upon that also. Because there is some clarity given here. You see, Patanjali Shastri Justice has clarified in the case of CIT versus Ahmad Bhai Umar Bhai. What they have said, marginal notes in Indian statute as in an act of parliament cannot be referred to for the purpose of construing the statute. And the same view has been taken in many other cases. Many cases show that reference to marginal notes may be permissible in exceptional cases. So two different views institute is giving here. And we should include both the things in our answer. We say that court has said in many cases that marginal note cannot be taken as for the purpose of construing the section. At the same time, in exceptional cases, court may rely upon marginal note. But one more interesting point is that marginal note given for every article of the constitution has been considered as part of the constitution. Marginal notes appended to articles of the constitution have been held to be a part of constitution as passed by the constituent assembly and therefore have been used in construing the articles. So see, point number one, marginal note are summaries and side notes often found at the side of the section. Point number two, they are not a part of the enactment because they were not present when the act was passed in the parliament. Hence, they are not aids of construction. Point number three, in case of CIT versus Ahmad Bhai, Umar Bhai and company, Patanjali Shastri Justice. See, Patanjali Shastri ನೆನಪಾಗದಿದ್ರೆ ತೊಂದರೆ ಇಲ್ಲ. You just remember, in a decided case law, the court has held that, or court has declared that marginal note in Indian statute is as in the act of parliament cannot be referred to for the purpose of construing the statute, and same view has been taken in many other cases. Further, many cases show the reference to marginal notes may be permissible in exceptional cases. Exceptional cases. So again, point number 3 is here, point number 4 is here. And then comes last point, marginal notes appended to articles of the constitution have been held to be part of the constitution as passed by the constituent assembly. So 5 points have been given for here only. You can take this as 5 points. So 3 marks question if they ask, if you write all these 5 points, you'll definitely get the 3 marks. So that's the thing. Next, coming to definitional section or interpretation clause. Definitions. This particular part covers all the things about definition. So we have certain things about definition. So let us try to understand one by one. So definition. Let us ignore this. This part is not required for us. We can straight away go to this part. When a word or phrase is defined as having a particular meaning in the enactment, it is that meaning alone which must be given to it in interpreting a section of the act unless there be anything repugnant in the context. Very important point you have to remember. This is what we always say. We always keep on saying, whenever I start the law class, whenever I start a discussion, I say how to refer, how to take out the meaning of the words. So we always say that first refer to the definition section. When a word is not defined in the definition section, then you can go and check the General Clauses Act. When the word is not discussed in the General Clauses Act, only then you can go for the definitional section, your dictionary meanings. So that means whenever lawmaker is defining the phrase, what he is saying is, he is saying that the word will have a particular meaning in that particular act. It is that meaning alone which must be given to it in interpreting a section of the act unless there be anything repugnant in the context. This is called an exhaustive definition. This is called an exhaustive definition. The court cannot ignore an exhaustive statutory definition and try and extract what it considers to be true meaning of the expression independently of it. So there is a clear prohibition on court. Court cannot go beyond the meaning given by the act when the definition is exhaustive. Now you see, what is the purpose of definition? This point clarifies. The purpose of definition is twofold. That means two things are there. There are two purposes for a definition: to provide a key to proper interpretation of enactment, to shorten the language of the enacting part by avoiding repetition of same words contained in the definition. So to shorten the language of the enactment, you can say, to shorten the language of enactment and to provide a key for proper interpretation. Example, see, articles definition, they have not given us the definition. Rather, they say articles of a company means articles of association formed and amended under this act. See, they don't want to repeat this again and again in every provision. That is why they are saying article means this and this. So they are keeping it to short. They are trying to shorten the language. They are trying to shorten the language so that same thing need not be repeated again and again. So this can be one intention. Or second thing is providing a key for proper interpretation. Providing a key for proper interpretation. This can be the second intention of definition section. So these are the twofold objectives of definition. Next, type of definition: restrictive and exhaustive definition, ambiguous definition, definition subject to contrary context. So restrictive definition is when the word is defined using the word means. The definition prima facie is restrictive and exhaustive. We must restrict the meaning of the word to that given in the definition section. We must restrict the meaning. Similarly, where the word is defined to include such and such things, the definition is prima facie extensive. Here the word defined is not restricted to the meaning assigned to it, but has extensive meaning, which also includes meaning assigned to it in the definition section. Sometimes we find the word means and includes. In this case, the definition is exhaustive because first it says means, this is what it is, and it can also include these things. Share means share in the share capital of the company, and includes stock means one thing extra you're going to include it. That's it. This thing. On the other hand, if the word is defined to apply to and include, the definition is understood to be extensive. To apply to this case and includes these things also. It is extensive definition, or it is like inclusive definition. So that is the part. Now, what normally they do is they normally ask you to give a meaning, example for this. So you should be prepared for 2 examples also. Giving examples in this case is also important. So based on whatever law you have, either from income tax or from company law or from GST, whatever gets to your mind while you write the answer, make sure that you are prepared for at least one example for each of them. For inclusive definition, for exhaustive definition. One with means, one with includes. So definition becomes an important part of writing the answer when it comes to definition part. Next, these things are not required, not very relevant. Here you can come here. A definition section may also be worded as is deemed to include, which again is an inclusive or extensive definition. Deemed to include means extensive definition, as such a word are used to bring in legal fiction something within the word defined. Public company definition, if you see, public company means a company other than private company, and public company, deemed public company is what they say. When a company, when a company is controlled, when a private company is when a private company is a subsidiary company of company other than a private company, that company will be deemed to be a public company. That is what we see in the definition, section 2 clause 71 of the Companies Act. So that can also be brought in as an example for this particular part. So that is also inclusive or extensive definition, because we are adding something extra by creating a legal fiction. Whenever they use the word is deemed to include, we are creating a legal fiction. That is why it is extensive definition. Next, ambiguous definition. Ambiguous definition means we may find that definition section may itself be ambiguous, and so it may have to be interpreted in the light of other provisions of the act. Because you see, definition of the word is there in one place, but when you use it with the different provisions of the act, it gives us different meaning. That is why in that case, what you are supposed to do is you should understand the particular definition in the context. In which context you're using that particular word, from that context you should be having a clarity on that. So termination of service of a seasonal worker after the work was over does not amount to retrenchment as per Industrial Dispute Act. But termination of employment of a daily wager who is engaged in a project on completion of the project will amount to retrenchment if the worker had not been told when employed that his employment will end on completion of the project. So there is clarity given. So in this case, what happens is such type of definition is not to be read in isolation. Termination word is there. No, termination In general meaning, when I say termination means putting an end to one person's job. Putting an end to one person's job is called as terminating someone or termination of the job. But what they are saying is termination in case of seasonal employment, when the season is over, if that employee has no job and you remove him from the job, it is not termination, it seems. But when the same thing happens, when a project is complete and you say that tomorrow onwards don't come to work because I don't have any other project, that amounts to termination. So this thing, this is what a word can be ambiguous in some situations. So that is what is said in this particular context. Next, going on further, definition subject to contrary context. When a word is defined to bear a number of inclusive meaning, the sense in which the word is used in particular provision must be ascertained from the context of the scheme of the act, the language of the provision, and other object intent to be served thereby. Subject to contrary means if this particular situation comes, this is the meaning. If situation B comes, the meaning will differ. So it is purely based on the intention of the lawmaker. You should always understand such definitions purely based on the context, language of the provision, and object intended to be served thereby. What is the object of that particular provision? So these things are to be kept in mind while using these type of definitions. Definition subject to a contrary context. Next aid of construction that is important is illustrations. Illustrations are normally given as examples in a particular statute. So we would find that many, though not all sections, many sections have illustrations appended to them. So these illustrations follow the text of the section and therefore do not form part of the section. They follow the text of the section and do not form part of the section. They are not the part of the section. Adre, illustrations do form a part of the statute and are considered to be relevant and value in construing the text of the section. So these stand you have to clarify to the institute. Illustrations do not form the part of the section, but illustrations form the part of the act. That means when you consider the entire act, illustrations are very much part of that. When you consider a particular section, illustrations are not the part of that particular section because illustrations are always given as an example derived out from that particular section. Illustrations cannot have the effect of modifying the language of the section and can neither curtail nor expand the ambit of the section. Illustration can only give you clarity on the section. It can neither elaborate or it can neither curtail the meaning of the section. So these can be the 4 important points with respect to illustrations. These can be the 4 important points that you can keep in mind with respect to illustrations. Going on further, we have provisos. Provisos means using the word provided that. In a particular section, normally we come across this particular thing. See, when it comes to proviso, you cannot ignore this box. This box is also important because it gives me the difference between proviso, exception, and saving clause. So you see there, the normal function of proviso is to accept something out of the enactment or to qualify something stated in the enactment, which would be within its purview if the proviso were not there. So whenever proviso word is used, it always creates an exception. You take any section, provided that at the height of the code, it creates some exceptions in that particular context. Contextually, provided that in case of 1-person company, that is for all other companies, this is the provision. For 1-person company, this is an exception. In case of section 96, you see, section 96 explain again. When they say section 96, they say every company other than 1-person company is required to have AGM. While telling so many other things, they say one AGM shall be held for every year. One AGM shall be held for every year. Proviso says, in case of first AGM, if first AGM is held within 9 months, there is no need of holding any AGM in the year of incorporation. So they created an exception. General rule is that every year there should be one AGM, but one specific rule says that in case of first AGM, in the year of incorporation, you need not have the AGM if the AGM is conducted within 9 months of end of financial year. So proviso normally creates an exception. Its function is to qualify a main general rule that is conveyed in the main section, or to qualify something stated in the enactment which would be within its purview if the proviso were not there. A proviso is embedded or inserted, we can say, in the main body of the section and becomes an integral part of it. Provisos are very much part of the sections. Provisos that are so included begin with the words provided that. So this can be the third point. Provided that, provided further that, provided also that, provided also that, provided also that. The effect of proviso is to qualify the preceding enactment which is expressed in terms which are too general As a general rule, proviso is added to an enactment to qualify. So we can consider this as the point. Instead of going for all some sub points, we can consider this as a summary point there. Point number 4, a proviso is added to an enactment to qualify or to create an exception to what is in the enactment. Ordinarily, a proviso is not interpreted as stating a general rule. What it does is it gives a meaning of specific rule. Instead of going for a general rule, it gives me the meaning of a specific rule. On the other hand, exception clauses are intended to restrain the enacting clause to a particular case. ಈ ಕೇಸಿಗೆ ಅಪ್ಲಿಕೇಬಲ್ ಆಗುವುದಿಲ್ಲ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳುವುದಕ್ಕೆ we bring in exception case, other than or exceptional cases. For these companies it is exempt. ಅಲ್ಲಿ proviso create ಮಾಡಿದ ಹಾಗೆ ಮಾಡೋಕ್ಕಿಂತ rather what we do is exceptions is intended to restrain the enacting clause to a particular case. Proviso is used to remove the special case from the general enactment and provide for them specially. ಒಂದು particular rule ಅನ್ನು ಕೇಸ್ ಎ ಕೇಸ್ ಬಿ ಕೇಸಿಗೆ ಅಪ್ಲಿಕೇಬಲ್ ಇಲ್ಲ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳುವುದಕ್ಕೆ ನಾವು ಎಕ್ಸೆಪ್ಷನ್ ಪ್ರೊವಿಷನ್ಸ್ ಗಳನ್ನು ಯೂಸ್ ಮಾಡ್ತೇವೆ. ವಿ ನಾರ್ಮಲಿ ಯೂಸ್ ಎಕ್ಸೆಪ್ಷನ್ಸ್. ಆದ್ರೆ ಕೇಸ್ ಎ ಅನ್ನು ಒಂದು ಜನರಲ್ ರೂಲ್ ಇಂದ ತೆಗೆದು ಅದಕ್ಕೊಂದು ಸ್ಪೆಸಿಫಿಕ್ ರೂಲ್ ಹಾಕಬೇಕು ಅಂತಾದ್ರೆ ವಿ ಯೂಸ್ ದ ಪ್ರಾವಿಸೋ. ಸೊ ಇಫ್ ದೇರ್ ಆರ್ 5 ಸ್ಟೂಡೆಂಟ್ಸ್, I say one particular rule and I want to say that student number 5 need not follow this at all. That time exception comes. But I say the rule for 5 students, then I want to say that for student number 1, this rule will not apply. Instead of that, this another rule I will define. Then I use the word proviso. Last one is save as otherwise. So it is saving clause. So saving clause in it today, it is used to preserve from destruction certain rights. Save as otherwise provided. That means when you read a particular context, when they use the word save as otherwise provided, that saving clause also should be read. So it will not destroy. It preserves from destruction certain rights, remedies or privileges already existing. Already ಆದದನ್ನು destroy ಮಾಡದೆ ಹೊಸತೊಂದು ರೂಲ್ ಅನ್ನು ಹೇಳುವುದಕ್ಕೆ saving clause ಅಂತ ಹೇಳ್ತಾರೆ. These are the 3 different clauses which must be understood clearly. Then it is a cardinal rule of interpretation is that proviso or exception to a particular provision in a statute, in a provision of a statute only embraces the field which is covered by the main provision. It carves out an exception to the main provision to which it has been enacted as a proviso and not to any other. So proviso is always given for a one particular general rule ಗೆ proviso ಬರುವಂತದ್ದು. ಒಂದು ಜನರಲ್ ಪ್ರೊವಿಷನ್ ಇಡೀ ಆಕ್ಟಿಗಲ್ ನಾರ್ಮಲಿ ಒಂದು ಪರ್ಟಿಕ್ಯುಲರ್ ಜನರಲ್ ರೂಲ್ ಇರ್ತದೆ. ಆ ಜನರಲ್ ರೂಲ್ ಒಂದು proviso exception ಕ್ರಿಯೇಟ್ ಮಾಡುವಂತದ್ದು. That is what is the cardinal principle of proviso, cardinal rule of interpretation. This can be included as 5th point when it comes to proviso. This can be included as 5th point. Now coming to the explanation. You take 455, explanation is there. Subsidiary company definition, explanation is there. Holding company definition, explanation is there. So what does explanation do? Explanation is at time appended to a section to explain the meaning of the certain words or phrases using in the section or of the purport of the section. So first intention is to explain the meaning. Second one, an explanation may be added to include something within the section or to exclude something from it. Include something within the section. Example, you take the provisions of reduction of share capital. You take the provision of buyback of share capital. There, they are saying free reserves includes securities premium. They say example, you see, free reserves includes securities premium. Explanation is inserted there. Explanation is used for inserting something, including something. Then you come to 455. They give us explanation of significant accounting transactions. Explanation gives us significant accounting transaction. Explanation says that 4 transactions are not significant accounting transactions. Their explanation is used for excluding something from the main section. So function of explanation is twofold. It can be either to insert something or to remove something from the main section. Remember it. Examples also very important. If you write these examples, your answers will get more value. Value addition will be happening for your answers. So an explanation may be added to include something. Example, free resource explanation in reduction of share capital or buyback of share capital. It can be for section. Example, significant accounting transaction explanation given under section 4. So an explanation should normally be read as to harmonize with and clear up the ambiguity in the main section. It should not be construed as to widen the ambit of the section. This is an important point you have to keep in mind. Again, It is not widening the scope. Rather, you have to construct it within the scope of the section only. A section is applicable ಆಗುವಾಗೆ ಮಾತ್ರ ನೀವು ಅದನ್ನು ಓದಬೇಕು. This is what the provision of explanation is all about. This is the provision of explanation is all about. Next comes schedules. Schedules. Companies act as 7 different schedules. FEMA act as certain schedules. LLP act as 4 schedules. Now, what is schedules? Schedule form part of the act. First thing, schedules form part of the act. They must be read together with the act for all purpose of construction. They must be read together with the act. Expressions in the schedule cannot control or prevail over the expression in the enactment. Third important point. So when there is conflict between schedule and act, act is what prevails. If there appears to be any inconsistency between schedule and the enactment shall prevail. If there is any inconsistency between schedule and enactment, the enactment shall always prevail. They often contain details and forms for working out the policy. Schedule 3 gives us the format of financial statement. Schedule 2 gives us about useful life of depreciation. Schedule 7 gives us the activities for corporate social responsibility. Schedule 6 gives us the activity for infrastructure projects. So schedule always gives us details and forms for working out policy underlying the sections of the statute. So this is the 5th thing that we can include. And last internal aid of construction is reading the statute as a whole. So what do they intend to say when they say read the statute as a whole? What is their intention? They say it is an elementary principle that construction of a statute is to be made of all its parts taken together and not one part only. Very, very important rule. You are not going to read that one part of the act and say this is the meaning. I should always take it as a whole. Entire act should be taken as a whole. Similarly, when it comes to deed, the deed must be read as a whole in order to ascertain the true meaning of several clauses, and the words of each clause should be so interpreted as to bring them into harmony with the other provisions. If that interpretation does no violence to the meaning of which they are naturally susceptible. And the same approach would apply with equal force with regard to acts and rules passed by the legislature. See, this part you can ignore if you want, because it is more of deeds rather than act. You can say the same approach, that is reading the statute as a whole, would apply with equal force with regard to acts and rules passed by the legislature. One of the safest guides to the construction of sweeping general words is to examine other words of like import in same enactment or instrument to see what limitation must be imposed on them. If we find that a number of such expressions have to be subject to limitations and qualifications, and that such limitations and qualifications are of same nature, that circumstance forms a strong argument for subjecting the expression in dispute to similar limitation and qualification. That means they are saying safest guide to construction of sweeping general words is to examine other words of like meaning, like import, is in the same enactment or instrument to see what limitations must be imposed on them. What is the restriction you are imposing on that particular, or to what extent you are widening or you are reducing the meaning of that particular word is what you are seeing. If we find that number of such expressions have to be subject to limitations and qualifications, and that such limitations and qualifications are of same nature, that circumstances forms a strong argument for subjecting the expression in dispute to similar limitation and qualification. So if one section of the act requires notice should be given, then a verbal notice would generally be sufficient. Notice ಕೊಡಬೇಕು ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿದ್ರೆ verbal notice ಆಗುತ್ತದೆ. But if another section provides that notice should be served upon a person or left with him or in a particular manner or place, then it would be obviously indicated that a written notice was intended. ಎರಡೂ ಕಡೆ ಯೂಸ್ ಮಾಡ್ತಿರುವಂತದ್ದು ನೋಟಿಸ್, ಆದ್ರೆ ಅದ್ರ ಒಟ್ಟಿಗೆ ಯಾವ ವರ್ಡ್ ಯೂಸ್ ಆಗ್ತಿದೆ, ಲಿಮಿಟೇಷನ್ ಏನ್ ಹಾಕಿದ್ದಾರೆ ಅದನ್ನ ನೆನ್ಪಿಟ್ಕೊಳ್ಬೇಕು. ನೋಟಿಸ್ ಅಂತ ಖಾಲಿ ಹೇಳಿದ್ರೆ ವರ್ಬಲ್ ನೋಟಿಸ್ ಆಗುತ್ತದೆ. ಆರ್ ವೆನ್ ದೇ ಸೇ ನೋಟಿಸ್ ಮಸ್ಟ್ ಬಿ ಸರ್ವ್ಡ್, ಇಟ್ ಮೀನ್ಸ್ ಯು ಆರ್ ಗೋಯಿಂಗ್ ಟು ಗಿವ್ ಹಿಮ್ ಅ ರಿಟರ್ನ್ ನೋಟಿಸ್ ಕೊಡಬೇಕು ಅಂತ ಆಗ್ತದೆ. ಸೊ ಇಟ್ ಇಸ್ ಪ್ಯೂರ್ಲಿ ಡಿಪೆಂಡೆಂಟ್ ಆನ್ ದ ವರ್ಡಿಂಗ್ಸ್, ಹೌ ದೇ ಆರ್ ಯೂಸ್ಡ್, ಕಂಟೆಕ್ಸ್ಟ್ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಹೇಗೆ ಯೂಸ್ ಮಾಡಿದ್ದಾರೆ ಆ ಕಂಟೆಕ್ಸ್ಟ್ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ನಾನು ಅದನ್ನು ಅರ್ಥ ಮಾಡ್ಕೊಳ್ಬೇಕಾಗ್ತದೆ. ದಿಸ್ ಇಸ್ ಅಬೌಟ್ ರೀಡಿಂಗ್ ದ ಸ್ಟ್ಯಾಚ್ಯೂಟ್ ಆಸ್. So these are the parts of internal aids of construction. So these are important internal aids of construction which can be tested as an independent area. One or two areas can be tested in the examination. I hope it is clear to us, everybody. Interpretation, internal aids of construction, whether it is clear, everybody, please make sure that you have understood this. It is clear to us. Hello, my dears. I'm waiting for your response. If you can give me a response in the chat box. Hello, class. Are you all with me? So next important area that we have to consider here is your primary rules of construction. I'll go for primary rules of construction. Next, as the next important area. In primary rules of construction, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 primary rules. 7 primary rules are there. Rule of literal construction, rule of reasonable construction, rule of harmonious construction, rule in Hayden's case or mischief rule, rule of beneficial construction, rule of exceptional construction, rule of adjustive generis. So all are important rules. Let us make an analysis of them. Rule of literal construction. So the first and primary rule of construction is that the intention of the legislature must be found in the words used by the legislature itself. So we can straight away go here. First point here. If the words of a statute are capable of one construction only, then it would not be open to court to adopt any hypothetical construction. Hypothetical means imaginary construction. It cannot make an imaginary construction on the ground that such hypothetical construction is more consistent with the alleged object and policy of the act. This is the first rule that literal construction says. If the words of a statute are capable of one construction only, where there is no possibility of any double meaning, you should go with the single meaning that it has. Literally, it means that where only one meaning can be driven out from a particular word used in a particular statute, you cannot make any hypothetical assumptions. You have to simply rely upon what the wordings give as a meaning, what meaning is carried by that particular word. So, if the word of a statute are capable of one construction only, then it would not be open to the court to adopt any hypothetical construction on the grounds that such hypothetical construction is more consistent with the alleged object and policy of the act. Second, cardinal rule. It is a cardinal rule of construction that statute must be construed literally and grammatically. Statute must be construed literally and grammatically, giving the words their ordinary and natural meaning. We say this as ONG rule. Ordinary, natural, grammatical meaning. Ordinary, natural, grammatical meaning should be given to the word. The language in the statute must be construed in their grammatical sense. The correct course is to take the words themselves and arrive, if possible, at their meaning without reference to cases in the first instance. That is why we see case laws are always taken up only when there is ambiguity. We never go for case laws first. We always try to interpret the wordings of the law itself. Only when we find that wordings are ambiguous, then we will make a reference to the case laws. So that is the second rule. The cardinal rule of construction is that statute must be construed literally and grammatically, giving the word their ordinary, natural, and grammatical meaning. Ordinary, natural, and grammatical meaning. Third rule, if the phraseology of a statute is clear and unambiguous and capable of one and only one interpretation, then it would not be correct to extrapolate those words out of their natural and ordinary sense. Again, see, earlier they said earlier they said hypothetical meaning you cannot give. Now they are saying you cannot extrapolate one and the same things. There's no difference. So you need not repeatedly write these things. One point if you write, it is more than sufficient. When the language of a statute is plain and unambiguous, it is not open for the court to take any hypothetical construction simply with the view of carrying out suppressed intention of the legislature. So what you do is you simply remember this point. This and this point is sufficient. First point, if you remember, it is sufficient. This point is sufficient. Here only this point is sufficient. Here this point is not required literally, because same thing we have already discussed above. It is sufficient if you remember those things. Then third one. This is also not required, because same thing again and again they are repeating. Same thing. No difference. The principle is contained in the Latin maxim. Based on what principle are we doing this? The principle is contained in the Latin maxim absoluta sententia expositor non indigit. An absolute sentence or preposition needs no expositor. Plain words require no explanation. The principle is contained in Latin maxim, which gives the meaning plain words require no explanation. Now, second important principle in this particular rule. After these 4 points tell us the meaning of literal construction. Next, second important part is occasions may arise when a choice has to be made between two interpretations. One is narrow, one is broader, one is wider, one is bolder. In such a situation, if narrower interpretation would fail to achieve to manifest the purpose of the legislation, one should rather adapt the wider one. So, same word. Education. Normally, we take this example. Education. Education can be interpreted in narrower sense as normal school education. Education can also be interpreted in the wider sense. Every type of education. Now, when the purpose is broader, I should go for the broader meaning rather than going for the narrower meaning. There they have given the example. When we talk of disclosure of nature of concern or interest, financial or otherwise, of a director or manager of a company in subject matter of proposed motion, referred to in section 102. 102 is explanatory statement. When you give explanatory statement for a notice for special business, we have to interpret in its broader sense of referring to any concern or interest containing any information and facts that may enable members to understand the meaning, scope, and implication of the items and to take decisions thereon. What is required is a full and frank disclosure without reservation or suppression. For instance, where son or daughter or father or mother or brother or sister is concerned in any contract or matter, the shareholders ought to fairly be informed. So it is not just the director, it is the relative of the director's interest is also to be disclosed. So that is what they want to say. The shareholders ought to be fairly informed of it and the material facts disclosed to them. Here, restricted, narrower interpretation would defeat the very purpose of the disclosure. So we should go for the broader one. Interest means interest of every person, including the relatives. That is what we have to take a meaning. The third important principle that we can drive out. When a matter which would have been but has not been provided for in a statute cannot be supplied by the court. Very, very important. Something should have been there, but it is missing. But court cannot add those words now because it would amount to legislation and would not be construction. It would not be construction. So 3 important principles are derived out in literal construction. 3 important principles. One is what is literal construction. Second one is narrower, broader. Third one is where words are missing. Court cannot supply those words. These are the 3 important principles. These are the 3 important principles. Now again, the rule of literal interpretation can be read and understood in the following headings. 2 things they say: natural and grammatical meaning. Statutes are to be first understood in their natural, ordinary, or popular sense and must be construed according to their plain, literal, and grammatical meaning. If there is an inconsistency with the express intention or declared purpose of the statute, or it involves any absurdity, repugnancy, inconsistency, the grammatical sense must then be modified, extended, or abridged only to avoid such inconvenience, but no further. Ramavatar versus assistant sales tax, the betel leaf example, the pan example, where he says pan is a vegetable, but law says that pan cannot be taken as a vegetable. Pan should be, betel leaf should be taken in the popular sense as a commercial crop. Then technical word are to be understood in technical sense. This point of literal construction is that technical words are to be understood in technical sense only. That means when a particular word is technically defined in the particular act, you should be taking out the meaning in technical sense only and not in any other sense. These are the points to remember. So this can be fourth point and this can be fifth point to remember. Fourth point to remember and fifth point to remember in rule of literal construction. So when it comes to literal construction, summarize. Literal construction has 5 different points to be kept in mind. One is, what do we mean by literal construction? Literal construction simply says that you cannot go beyond the words. The words should be understood in their true, natural, ordinary, grammatical sense. Then coming to second part. Second part says that when the word can be interpreted one in narrower way, one in broader way, if narrower word meaning doesn't manifest the purpose, you should go for broader interpretation. Section 102 is given as the example. Third one, when a particular word was supposed to be there, but it is not there, court cannot supply those words because it would amount to legislation. Fourth one is natural and grammatical meaning should be given. If it creates absurdity, it can be modified only to avoid the inconvenience and not further. And last one is technical words are to be understood in technical sense only. These are the 5 things you have to keep in mind from literal interpretation. 5 things. So if at all a question is asked from literal interpretation, it should be from 5 of these areas only and not from any other area. Going further, rule of reasonable construction. What does it say? According to this rule, the words of a statute must be construed so as to lead to a sensible meaning. You don't remember all these things. You need not remember all these things. Ut tres magis valid quam perect. The words of a statute must be construed to lead a sensible meaning. If you remember this much, it is sufficient. First point. Words of a statute must be construed so as to lead a sensible meaning, something that makes sense. The words or phrases of a statute are to be given their ordinary meaning. It is only when the words of an enactment are capable of 2 constructions, double meaning only possible ಇದೆ, ಆಗ ನೀವು reasonable construction ಬರ್ತೀರಿ. Double meaning ಅಂದ್ರೆ double meaning, yeah. More than one meaning where it is possible. Then you have to go for reasonable construction. You have to go for something called as reasonability. Best example is, what example we give? Section 5. Best example that we give is section 105. Proxy. Proxy doesn't have a right to speak. Hello. Proxy doesn't have a right to speak andre. Proxy ಮಾತಾಡ್ಲಿಕ್ಕಿಲ್ಲ ಅಂತವಾ? Proxy business ನ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಮಾತಾಡ್ಲಿಕ್ಕಿಲ್ಲ. So there, if you give the literal meaning, it fails. The intention fails. That is why we are making a reasonable construction. We are giving reasonability test for that particular provision. Reasonability test tarta ideve. That is what is the meaning of reasonable construction. The words or phrases of a statute are to be given their ordinary meaning. It is only when the words of enactment are capable of 2 construction that there is a scope for interpretation or construction. Then that interpretation which furthers the object can be preferred to that which is likely to defeat or impair the policy or object. See, this can be taken as the second point. When the words of an enactment are capable of 2 constructions, there is a scope for interpretation or construction. The interpretation which furthers the object can be preferred to that which is likely to defeat or impair the policy or object. Third one, when the grammatical interpretation leads to manifest absurdity, then the court shall interpret the statute so as to resolve the inconsistency and make the enactment consistent whole. A consistent whole. So, grammatical meaning, when you are sticking to the grammatical meaning, see, this is actually, from here the exceptional construction is derived, because there we say and should be read as and, may should or should be read as or, but where it is required we will have to interchange them. So this is only when the grammatical interpretation leads to manifest absurdity, then court shall interpret the statute so as to resolve the inconsistency and make the enactment as a consistent whole. The principle is based on the rule that the words of a statute must be construed reasonably so as to give effect to enactment rather than reduce it to a futility. Statute should be construed grammatically. You can ignore this part. This part is not required. When grammatical interpretation leads to certain absurdity, it is permissible to depart therefrom and to interpret the provisions of the statutes in a manner so as to avoid the absurdity. This departure from the grammatical construction is permissible only to the extent it avoids the absurdity and no further. This is also called as golden rule of interpretation. If court finds that giving a plain meaning to a word will not be fair or reasonable construction, it becomes the duty of the court to depart from the dictionary meaning and to adopt the construction which will advance the remedy and suppress the mischief, provided the court does not have to resort to conjecture or surmise. A reasonable construction will be adopted in accordance with the policy and object of the statute. See, again, they are combining so many things in the ICE material, because these wordings will come further also when you go for some other types of construction also. So, what we have to remember here is, when it comes to reasonable construction, these 3 points. One is statute must be construed to sensible meaning. When the enactment is capable of giving two constructions, these things you have to remember. And grammatical interpretation, if it leads to absurdity, then court has to make effort to resolve the inconsistency and make the enactment consistent whole. If you remember these 3 points, it is more than sufficient for reasonable construction. Beyond this, you need not remember, because it is overlapping with certain other provisions of this particular further rules that we have. So that is why you remember only these 3 points. It is more than sufficient. Moving on further. Next we have is harmonious construction. Harmonious construction. So what does harmonious construction say? So let us see harmonious construction patterns. Part by part, let us try to understand this. So many parts are there for this. Let us try to understand one by one. It is a recognized rule of interpretation of statutes and deeds that expression used therein should ordinarily be understood in a sense in which they best harmonize with the object of the statute. The opposite of harmony is conflict. Thus, this rule is applied when there is a conflict between two provisions of the statute. Harmonious construction is always applied when there is conflict between two provisions of the statute. This rule comes into aid when there is a conflict between the provision of a statute and the object which the legislature had in view. Again, this is also one more possibility. Section says one thing, object says another thing. Then also harmonious construction has to be followed. Where an expression is susceptible of narrow or technical meaning as well as popular meaning, court would be justified in assuming that legislature used the expression in the sense which would carry out its objects and reject that which renders it invalid. Where an expression is susceptible of a narrower or technical meaning as well as a popular meaning, the court would be justified in assuming that the legislature used the expression in the sense which would carry out its object and reject that which renders it invalid. It's the basic rule of interpretation that if it is possible to avoid a conflict between two provisions, fourth one, it's a basic rule of interpretation that if it is possible to avoid a conflict between two provisions on a proper construction thereof, then it is the duty of the court to construe them that they are in harmony with each other. The statute must be read as a whole, and every provision in the statute must be construed with reference to the context and other clauses in the statute, so as to make the statute a consistent enactment and not reduce it to futility. Now comes an important part. But where it is not possible to give effect to both the provisions harmoniously, collision may be avoided by holding that one section which is in conflict with another merely provides for an exception or a specific rule different from the general rule contained in the other. A specific rule will override a general rule. That means when it is not at all possible to create a harmony, what we do is, for that specific case, that particular specific rule will apply. That for the specific case, the specific rule will apply. For other things, the general rule will apply. So that is what we need to see for. So a specific rule will override a general rule. But remember that this rule can be adopted only when there is a real and not merely apparent conflict between provisions, where the words of a statute on a reasonable construction thereof admit of one meaning only, then such natural meaning will prevail. The court shall not attempt an interpretation based on equity or harmonious construction. In some cases, statute may give a clear indication as to which provision is subservient and which overrides. This is done by use of words subject to, notwithstanding, and without prejudice. So this is what is said in the act itself. Now, till here, it is harmonious construction. Next one is where act itself gives us the harmony, where act itself creates the harmony. So that is what we have to understand. Whenever the word subject to is used, what does it mean? Subject to, when used in provision, is that when same subject matter is covered by that provision and by another provision or enactment, subject to which it operates, and there is a conflict between them, then the later will prevail over the former. The limitation cannot operate when subject matter of two provisions is not same. Thus, a clause that uses the word subject to is subservient to another. So when they say subject to, provision A is subject to provision B, then provision B will prevail over provision A. Only if provision B is met, provision A can be followed. Otherwise, provision A cannot be followed. So subject to, when they say the later will prevail over the former. Subject to what is what they are saying? No, that will prevail over the former. This is the intention of the intention of using the word subject to. Whenever they use the word subject to, this is the intention. Any change in the name of a company shall be subject to provisions of subsection 2 and subsection 3 of section 4 and shall not have effect except with the approval of central government in writing. So before you change the name under section 13(2), you should follow section 4, subsection 2 and subsection 3. So that will prevail. This implies that any change in the name of the company has to be in accordance with the provisions of subsection 4(2) and subsection 4(3). Next thing is non-obstante. Non-obstante clause. Whenever the lawmaker uses the word notwithstanding, what do they mean? Whenever they use the word notwithstanding, what do they mean? When a clause begins with the word notwithstanding anything contained is called a non-obstante clause. Unlike subject to, notwithstanding clause has the effect of making the provisions prevail over the others. See, subject to adre enagtade, second thing will prevail over the first thing. When you read second ones, first thing also should be kept in mind. That is what is subject to. Section 2 will be subject to section 1 anta helidre. Both section 1, when you read section 2, section 1 should also be kept in mind. That is subject to. When I say notwithstanding, notwithstanding anything contained in section 1 anta helidre, when you read section 2, nothing contained in section 1 will apply to you. Nothing contained in section 1 will apply to you. So it has an overriding effect. Clause will prevail over the other provisions. Examples: notwithstanding anything contained in another section or subsection of that statute, the clause will override such other section or subsection. Notwithstanding anything contained in a statute, the clause will override the entire enactment. Idi act anne override ಮಾಡ್ತದೆ. Notwithstanding anything contained in specific sections or subsections or all the provisions contained in another statute, the clause will prevail over the other enactment. RBI Act ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಹೇಳ್ತಾರೆ section 31 ಅಲ್ಲಿ. Nothing, notwithstanding anything contained in Negotiable Instrument Act. That means when you read section 31 of Negotiable Instrument Act, when you read section 31 of RBI Act, the entire Negotiable Instrument Act itself will not be applicable. Notwithstanding anything contained in any other law for time being in force, the clause will override all other laws. Any other laws, all other laws. So these are the 4 type of non-obstante clause. Next one is, last one, without prejudice. Without prejudice word use ಆದರೆ ಏನಾಗ್ತದೆ? When certain particular provision follows general provisions, and when it stated that particular provisions are without prejudice to general provisions, the particular provisions would not restrict or circumscribe the operations and generality of the preceding general provision. See, sometimes what they say is notwithstanding anything contained. So, or notwithstanding Allah, without prejudice to any criminal liability. Civil liability of prospectus. See, without prejudice to criminal liability, civil liability ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿದ್ರೆ, when a person misstates something in the prospectus, criminal liability ಬಂದೇ ಬರ್ತದೆ ಅದರೊಟ್ಟಿಗೆ. Without affecting the punishment under criminal liability, civil liability will also be levied. The particular provision shall operate in addition to and not in derogation of the general provision. So ಎರಡೂ ಕೂಡ ಬರ್ತದೆ ಅಂತ. That is without prejudice. When they use the word without prejudice, without harming, without affecting. That is the meaning. Next, Hayden's case or mischief rule. In Hayden's case or mischief rule, shall always remember these 4 points. Very important. Hayden's case or mischief rule ಯಾಕೆ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿದ್ರೆ ಪರ್ಪಸಿವ್ ಅದು. ಯಾಕೆ ಪರ್ಟಿಕ್ಯುಲರ್ ಆಕ್ಟ್ ಬಂತು ಅದನ್ನು ಫೈಂಡ್ ಔಟ್ ಮಾಡಲಿಕ್ಕೆ ನಾವು Hayden's rule ಅನ್ನು ಯೂಸ್ ಮಾಡ್ತೇವೆ. When the language used in a statute is capable of more than one interpretation, the most firmly established rule for construction is principle laid down in Hayden's case. The intention of this rule is always to make such construction as shall suppress the mischief and advance the remedy according to the true intention of the legislation. It will suppress the mischief and advance the remedy according to true intention of the legislation. Now, how to identify the true intention of the legislation? It is given in this particular case, Hayden's case. How to identify the intention? Our intention ಅನ್ನು identify ಮಾಡೋದು ಹೇಗೆ? So what does it say? What was the law before making of an act? ಒಂದು ಆಕ್ಟ್ ಬರುವ ಮುಂಚೆ ಯಾವ ಲಾ ಇತ್ತು? What was the defect, mischief or hardship caused by earlier law? How does the Act of Parliament seek to resolve or cure the mischief or deficiency? What are the two reasons for the remedy? In 4 questions, when you answer, you will get a clarity as to why the new act has been brought out, and it will suppress the mischief and it will advance the remedy. So this is what is, and then court shall make such construction as will suppress the mischief and advance the remedy and suppress the substantial inventions and evasions of continuance of the mischief. This is what is Hayden's rule. Hayden's rule ನೀವು ಇಷ್ಟು ಈ 4 questions ಗಳನ್ನು ನೆನಪಿಟ್ಟುಕೊಂಡ್ರೆ ಸಾಕು. Whenever a question is asked on Hayden's rule. Next comes rule of beneficial construction. Normally beneficial construction ಯಾವಾಗ ಯೂಸ್ ಮಾಡ್ತೀವಿ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿದ್ರೆ, when a law is going to benefit public at large, ಒಂದು ದೊಡ್ಡ ಪಾಪ್ಯುಲೇಷನ್ ಗೆ ನಿಮ್ಮ ಲಾ ಹೆಲ್ಪ್ ಆಗ್ತದೆ ಅಂತ ಆದ್ರೆ, we will normally go for beneficial construction. This is strictly speaking not a rule, but a method of interpreting a provision liberally so as to give effect to declared intention of the legislature. Beneficial construction will be given to a statute which brings into effect provisions for improving the conditions of certain classes of people who are underprivileged or who are not being treated fairly in the past. In such cases, it is permissible to give extended meaning to the words or clauses in the enactment. But this can only be done when 2 constructions are reasonably possible and not when the word in the statute is quite equivocal. ವರ್ಡ್ ಕ್ಲಿಯರ್ ಇದ್ರೆ ಆಗ ನಾವು ಯಾವುದೇ ಕನ್ಸ್ಟ್ರಕ್ಷನ್ ಹೋಗ್ಲಿಕ್ಕಿಲ್ಲ, ಲಿಟರಲ್ ಇಂಟರ್ಪ್ರಿಟೇಷನ್ ಗೆ ಹೋಗ್ಬೇಕು. ಆದ್ರೆ ಯಾವಾಗ ವರ್ಡ್ಸ್ ಕ್ಲಿಯರ್ ಇಲ್ವೋ ಆಗ ಯಾವುದು ಜಾಸ್ತಿ ಬೆನಿಫಿಟ್, ಜಾಸ್ತಿ ಪಾಪ್ಯುಲೇಷನ್ ಗೆ ಯಾವಾಗ ಬೆನಿಫಿಟ್ ಆಗ್ತದೋ ಅಂತ ಕನ್ಸ್ಟ್ರಕ್ಷನ್ ಗೆ ನಾವು ಹೋಗಬೇಕು. ದಿಸ್ ಇಸ್ ವಾಟ್ ಬೆನಿಫಿಷಿಯಲ್ ಕನ್ಸ್ಟ್ರಕ್ಷನ್ ಮೀನ್ಸ್. ದಿಸ್ ಇಸ್ ವಾಟ್ ದೇ ಸೇ ಇನ್ ದ ಬೆನಿಫಿಷಿಯಲ್ ಕನ್ಸ್ಟ್ರಕ್ಷನ್. Next is exceptional construction. Exceptional construction. We are going against the rule of grammar. Exceptional construction ಅಲ್ಲಿ ನಾವೇನ್ ಮಾಡ್ತೇವೆ, ರೂಲ್ ಆಫ್ ಗ್ರಾಮರ್ ಗೆ ಅಗೇನ್ಸ್ಟ್ ಆಗಿ ಹೋಗ್ತೇವೆ. ಸೊ ರೂಲ್ ಆಫ್ ಗ್ರಾಮರ್ ಬಿಟ್ಟು ಎಕ್ಸೆಪ್ಷನ್ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ನಾವು ಕನ್ಸ್ಟ್ರಕ್ಟ್ ಮಾಡ್ತೇವೆ. We already seen that words of a statute must be construed so as to give sensible meaning to them if possible. They ought to be construed ut res magis valet quam perit. In fact, Maxwell goes to extent of stating, notwithstanding the general rule that full effect must be given to every word, yet if no sensible meaning can be given to a word or phrase, or if it could defeat the real object of the enactment, it may, or rather it should be eliminated. ಒಂದು ಪರ್ಟಿಕ್ಯುಲರ್ ವರ್ಡ್ ನನಗೆ ಕ್ಲಿಯರ್ ಮೀನಿಂಗ್ ಕೊಡ್ತಾ ಇಲ್ಲ ಅಂತ ಎಲಿಮಿನೇಟ್ ಮಾಡಬೇಕು ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿ ಮ್ಯಾಕ್ಸ್ವೆಲ್ ಹೇಳ್ತಾನೆ. ನೋ ಎಕ್ಸೆಪ್ಷನಲ್ ಕನ್ಸ್ಟ್ರಕ್ಷನ್ ವಿತ್ ರೆಸ್ಪೆಕ್ಟ್ ಟು and or. And is a particle joining words. ಜಾಯಿನ್ ಮಾಡ್ಲಿಕ್ಕೆ ಯೂಸ್ ಮಾಡೋದು, ಎರಡು ಬೇರೆ ಬೇರೆ ಸೆಂಟೆನ್ಸ್ ಗಳನ್ನು ಜಾಯಿನ್ ಮಾಡ್ಲಿಕ್ಕೆ and ಯೂಸ್ ಆಗ್ತದೆ. ಎಕ್ಸ್ಪ್ರೆಸಿಂಗ್ ದ ರಿಲೇಷನ್ ಆಫ್ ಕನೆಕ್ಷನ್ ಆರ್ ಅಡಿಷನ್. The word and is normally conjunctive. In its conjunctive sense, the word is used to conjoin the words, clauses, or sentences, signifying that something is to follow in addition to that which precedes. The word or is disjunctive particle that marks an alternative, generally corresponding either that or this. Can and be read as or and vice versa. The word and is normally conjunctive while or is disjunctive, but sometimes and is read as or and vice versa to give effect to manifest the intention of the legislature as disclosed from the context. ಕೆಲವು ಸಲ ಯಾಕೆ to manifest the intention. And may legitimately be construed as or when the intention of the legislature is clear and when any other construction would tend to defeat such intention. Not only in the statutes but also in the documents, the two words and or are sometimes used synonymously and in same sense. That would depend on the context and meaning of the other provisions in same statute and document. Similarly, when statements or stipulations are coupled by and or, they are to be read either disjunctively or conjunctively. And bar or anta ಕೆಲವು ಸಲ ಕೊಟ್ಟಿರ್ತಾರೆ. ಆಗ may, must and shall. Let us first appreciate the distinction between mandatory and directory provisions. When the enactment or provision prescribes that the contemplated action be taken without any option or discretion, then such statute or provision or enactment will be called mandatory. Shall anta ಬರ್ತದೆ normally. ಮಾಡಲೇಬೇಕು, ಯಾವುದೇ ಆಪ್ಷನ್ ಇಲ್ಲ. Where acting authority is vested with discretion, choice or judgment, the statute or provision will be called directory. For example, section 110 ತಗೊಳ್ಳಿ. When you take section 110, section 110 immediately ನಿಮಗೆ ನೆನಪು ಬರೋದಿಲ್ಲ ಅಂತಂದ್ರೆ we can go for section 100. section 100 ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಬೋರ್ಡ್ ಆಫ್ ಡೈರೆಕ್ಟರ್ಸ್ ಮೇ ಕಾಲ್ EGM. ಅವರಿಗೆ ಬೇಕು ಅಂತಾದ್ರೆ EGM ಕರಿಬಹುದು, ಮೇ, ಅದು ಡಿಸ್ಕ್ರಿಷನರಿ ಆಯ್ತು. ಅದೇ ರಿಕ್ವಿಸಿಷನಿಸ್ಟ್ಗಳು ರಿಕ್ವೆಸ್ಟ್ ಕೊಟ್ರೆ ಬೋರ್ಡ್ ಆಫ್ ಡೈರೆಕ್ಟರ್ ಶಲ್ ಕಾಲ್ EGM, ಮ್ಯಾಂಡೇಟರಿ. ಅದು ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಶಲ್ ಮ್ಯಾಂಡೇಟರಿ. In deciding whether the statute is directory or mandatory, the question is whether there is anything that makes it the duty of the person on whom the power is conferred to exercise that power. ಸಿ ಮೇ ಅಂತ ಯೂಸ್ ಮಾಡಿರ್ಬೋದು ಅಥವಾ ಶಲ್ ಅಂತ ಯೂಸ್ ಮಾಡಿರ್ಬೋದು, ಅದು ನಮಗೆ ರೂಲ್ ಅಲ್ಲ. ನಾವು ಹೇಗೆ ನೋಡಬೇಕು, ಅದು ಡ್ಯೂಟಿಯಾ, ಅದು ಮಾಡದಿದ್ರೆ ಏನಾದ್ರು ಕಾನ್ಸಿಕ್ವೆನ್ಸ್ ಉಂಟಾ, ಅದನ್ನು ಮ್ಯಾಂಡೇಟರಿ ಅಂತಲೇ ತಗೊಳ್ಬೇಕು. ಕಾನ್ಸಿಕ್ವೆನ್ಸ್ ಇಲ್ವಾ, ಆಗ ಅದು ಡಿಸ್ಕ್ರಿಷನರಿ ಆಗುತ್ತೆ. In deciding whether the statute is directory or mandatory, the question is whether there is anything that makes it the duty of the person on whom the power is conferred to exercise that power. If it is so, then the statute is mandatory one. Otherwise, it is directory. The words may, shall, and must should initially be deemed to have been used in the natural and ordinary sense. May signifies permission and implies that authority has been allowed discretion. This normal sense imports command. Must is doubtlessly a word of command. In all cases, however, the intention of the legislature will guide the interpreter in his search of meaning. The question as to whether a statute is mandatory depends upon the intent of the legislature and not upon the language in which the intent is closed. In cases where normal significance of imperative and permissive term leads to absurd, inconvenient, or unreasonable results, they should be discarded. May, though permissive, sometimes has compulsory force and is to be read as shall. Although it is well settled that ordinarily the word may is always used as permissive sense, there may be circumstances where this word will have to be construed as having been used in mandatory or compulsory sense. Where the word may has been used as implying a requisite condition to be fulfilled, the court will and ought to exercise the powers which it should, and in such a case, the word may will have a compulsory force. Shall, though mandatory, is to be read as may. It is well settled that use of word shall does not always mean that enactment is obligatory or mandatory. It depends upon the context in which the word shall occurs. The employment of auxiliary verb shall is inconclusive, and similarly, the mere absence of the imperative is not conclusive either. The question whether any requirement is mandatory or directory has to be decided not merely on the basis of specific provision, which, for instance, sets out the consequences of the omission to observe the requirement, but on the purpose for which the requirement has been enacted, particularly in the context of other provisions of the Act and general scheme thereof. It would inter alia, among other things, depend on whether the requirement is insisted upon on as a protection for safeguarding the rights or of property the action might involve. So while reading this, you are not going to not only rely upon shall or may that is used in the act, rather you should go with the context in which it is used. Last one is rule of ejusdem generis. The last rule that is used as primary rule of construction is rule of ejusdem generis. The term ejusdem generis means of same kind of species. Simply stated, the rule is as follows: where specific words pertaining to a class or category or genus are followed by general word. A specific word pertaining to a class or category is followed by general word. The general words shall be construed as limited to the things of same kind as those specified. General rules are followed with specific rules. Then, specific words are followed by specific category of words are followed by general words. See here, this thing is important. When is the rule applicable? This is important. And also, exception to the rule of ejusdem generis is also important. Exception to the rule of ejusdem generis is also important. So first one is, when is it applicable? What is ejusdem generis is important. When is it applicable? The statute contains enumeration of specific words. That means numerous specific words should be given. The subject of enumeration consists of class or category. Onde class ಗೆ ಸಂಬಂಧಪಟ್ಟ words ಇರಬೇಕು. That class or category is not exhausted by enumeration. Exhaust ಆಗಿರಬಾರದು. ಅದಷ್ಟೇ ಅಲ್ಲ, ಅದರ ಮೇಲೆ ಇನ್ನಷ್ಟು ವರ್ಡ್ಸ್ ಇರಬೇಕು. General term should follow the enumeration, and there is no indication of a different legislative intent. The rule of ejusdem generis is not absolute rule of law, but only a part of wider principle of construction, and therefore this rule has no application where the intention of legislature is very clear. Intention clear ಇದ್ರೆ, ಅದಲ್ಲ ಅಂತ intention ಇದ್ರೆ, ಆಗ ನಾನು ejusdem generis ಗೆ ಹೋಗೋದೇ ಇಲ್ಲ. ejusdem generis ಆಗಬೇಕಾದ್ರೆ 5 ರೂಲ್ ಇರಬೇಕು. ಒಂದು, ನ್ಯೂಮರಸ್ ಸ್ಪೆಸಿಫಿಕ್ ವರ್ಡ್ಸ್ ಇರಬೇಕು. ಆ ನ್ಯೂಮರಸ್ ಸ್ಪೆಸಿಫಿಕ್ ವರ್ಡ್ಸ್ ಒಂದು ಕ್ಲಾಸ್ ಆಫ್ ಐಟಮ್ಸ್ ಗಳನ್ನು ಹೇಳ್ತಾ ಇರಬೇಕು. ಆ ಕ್ಲಾಸ್ ಎಕ್ಸಾಸ್ಟ್ ಆಗಿರಬಾರ್ದು. ಅದಷ್ಟು ನ್ಯೂಮರಸ್ ಸ್ಪೆಸಿಫಿಕ್ ವರ್ಡ್ಸ್ ಆದ ನಂತರ ಒಂದು ಜನರಲ್ ವರ್ಡ್ ಬಂದಿರಬೇಕು. ಅಂಡ್ ಇಂಟೆನ್ಷನ್ ಆಫ್ ದ ಲೆಜಿಸ್ಲೇಚರ್ ಯಾವುದೇ ರೀತಿಯಲ್ಲಿ ಆ ಜನರಲ್ ವರ್ಡ್ ಗೆ ಬೇರೆ ಮೀನಿಂಗ್ ಕೊಡ್ತಾ ಇರಬಾರದು. ಈ 5 ಕಂಡೀಷನ್ ಸ್ಯಾಟಿಸ್ಫೈ ಆದ್ರೆ ಮಾತ್ರ ejusdem generis ಅಪ್ಲಿಕೇಬಲ್ ಆಗ್ತದೆ. ಇಲ್ಲದಿದ್ರೆ ejusdem generis ಅಪ್ಲಿಕೇಬಲ್ ಆಗುದಿಲ್ಲ. ಯಾವಾಗ ejusdem generis ಅಪ್ಲಿಕೇಬಲ್ ಆಗುದಿಲ್ಲ? ಇಫ್ ದ ಪ್ರಿಸೀಡಿಂಗ್ ಟರ್ಮ್ ಇಸ್ ಜನರಲ್ as well as that which follows rule, that which follows this rule cannot be applied. ಎರಡೂ ಜನರಲೇ. Preceding term general, succeeding term general. Aga adjective general is applicable ಆಗುದಿಲ್ಲ. Where particular word exhausts the whole genus. Complete ಎಲ್ಲ ಒಂದಾಯ್ತಲ್ಲಿ ಮತ್ತೇನು ಆಡ್ ಮಾಡ್ಲಿಕ್ಕಿಲ್ಲ, ಆಗ adjective general ಬರುವುದಿಲ್ಲ. Where specific objects enumerated are essentially diverse in character, ಒಂದಕ್ಕೊಂದು ಸಂಬಂಧವೇ ಇಲ್ಲ, ಆಗಲೂ ಕೂಡ adjective general ಬರುವುದಿಲ್ಲ. Where there is an express intention of legislature that general term shall not be read, adjective general is the specific term. This is what is exception to the rule of adjective generis. Exception to the rule of adjective generis. So with this we conclude primary rules of interpretation. Next comes two other rules of secondary rules of interpretation. Other rules of interpretation ಎರಡಿದೆ. ನಾಸಿಟಾರ್ ಅಸೋಸಿ ಇದೆ, ಅದಾದ್ಮೇಲೆ ಕಂಟೆಂಪೊರನ ಎಕ್ಸ್ಪಸಿಟೋ ಇದೆ. Nausicaa associ is there, contemporana exposito is there. Let us try to understand what does this say. Nausicaa associ, sahvasa dosha. What does it say? When two or more words that are susceptible of analogous meaning, independent meaning, are coupled together, they are understood to be used in the cognate sense. When two or more words that are susceptible of analogous meaning are coupled together, they are understood to be used in cognate sense. They take their color from each other. That is the meaning of more general word being restricted to a sense analogous to that of less general. Analogous means normally similar. General word ಎರಡು ಬೇರೆ ಬೇರೆ ವರ್ಡ್ಸ್ ಗಳನ್ನು ಒಟ್ಟೊಟ್ಟಿಗೆ ಯೂಸ್ ಮಾಡಿದ್ರೆ ಅದು ಒಂದಕ್ಕೊಂದು ಅದರ ಕಲರ್ಸ್ ಅನ್ನು ಯಾವ್ದ್ರ ಅಸೋಸಿಯೇಷನ್ ಇಟ್ಕೊಳ್ತದೆ, ಆ ಅಸೋಸಿಯೇಟ್ ವರ್ಡ್ ಇಂದ ತಗೊಳ್ತದೆ ಅಂತ. ದಟ್ ಇಸ್ ವಾಟ್ ಇಟ್ ಮೀನ್ಸ್. ಸೊ ಟೂ ಎಕ್ಸಾಂಪಲ್ಸ್ ದೇ ಗಿವ್ ನಾರ್ಮಲಿ. ಫ್ರೆಶ್ ಆರೆಂಜ್ ಜ್ಯೂಸ್ ಇಸ್ ನಾಟ್ ಅ ಫ್ರೂಟ್ ಜ್ಯೂಸ್. ರೀಸನ್, ಮ್ಯಾನುಫ್ಯಾಕ್ಚರ್ಡ್ ಬೇವರೇಜಸ್. ಪರ್ಚೇಸ್ ಟ್ಯಾಕ್ಸ್ ಆಕ್ಟ್ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಎಲ್ಲಿಯಾದ್ರೂ ಈ ಸೆಂಟೆನ್ಸ್ ಕೊಟ್ರೆ ಏನಂತ ಹೇಳಿ, ಮ್ಯಾನುಫ್ಯಾಕ್ಚರ್ಡ್ ಬೇವರೇಜಸ್ ಇನ್ಕ್ಲೂಡಿಂಗ್ ಫ್ರೂಟ್ ಜ್ಯೂಸಸ್, ಬಾಟಲ್ಡ್ ವಾಟರ್ಸ್ ಅಂಡ್ ಸಿರಪ್. ಸಿ 3 ಇಂಡಿಪೆಂಡೆಂಟ್ ವರ್ಡ್ಸ್. ಬಾಟಲ್ಡ್ ಜ್ಯೂಸ್, ಫ್ರೂಟ್ ಜ್ಯೂಸ್ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳ್ತಿದ್ದಾರೆ, ಬಾಟಲ್ಡ್ ವಾಟರ್ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳ್ತಿದ್ದಾರೆ, ಸಿರಪ್ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳ್ತಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಈಗ ಈಚ್ ಆಫ್ ದ ವರ್ಡ್ಸ್ ವಿಲ್ ಟೇಕ್ ಇಟ್ಸ್ ಕಲರ್ ಫ್ರಮ್ ಈಚ್ ಅದರ್. ಅಸೋಸಿಯೇಟ್ ಇಟ್ ಕೀಪ್ಸ್. ಅದರ ಅಕ್ಕಪಕ್ಕ ಯಾವ ವರ್ಡ್ಸ್ ಇದೆ ಅದರಿಂದ ಕಲರ್ ಬರ್ತದೆ ಅದಕ್ಕೆ. ಈಗ ಫ್ರೂಟ್ ಜ್ಯೂಸ್ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿದ್ರೆ ನಾನು 2 ಟೈಪ್ ಆಫ್ ಫ್ರೂಟ್ ಜ್ಯೂಸ್ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳ್ಬೋದು. ಒಂದು ನ್ಯಾಚುರಲಿ ಎಕ್ಸ್ಟ್ರಾಕ್ಟೆಡ್ ಫ್ರೂಟ್ ಜ್ಯೂಸ್, ಮತ್ತೊಂದು ಮೆಷಿನ್ ಪ್ರೊಸೆಸ್ಡ್ ಫ್ರೂಟ್ ಜ್ಯೂಸ್. ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಫ್ರೂಟ್ ಜ್ಯೂಸ್ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿದ್ರೆ ಯಾವುದು? ನ್ಯಾಚುರಲಿ ಎಕ್ಸ್ಟ್ರಾಕ್ಟ್ ಮಾಡೋ ಫ್ರೂಟ್ ಜ್ಯೂಸ್ ಅನ್ನು ಮ್ಯಾನುಫ್ಯಾಕ್ಚರ್ಡ್ ಬ್ಯಾವರೇಜ್ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಬೇಕಾ ಬೇಡವಾ ಅಂತ ಕೇಳಿದ್ರೆ, ಐ ವಿಲ್ ಟೇಕ್ ದ ಕಲರ್ ಆಫ್ ಫ್ರೂಟ್ ಜ್ಯೂಸ್ from the associate it keeps. Bottled water, that means it should undergo a process. Syrup, that means it should undergo a process. ಹಾಗಾದ್ರೆ ಫ್ರೂಟ್ ಜ್ಯೂಸ್ ಅಂತಲೂ ಕೂಡ ಏನು, it should undergo a process. ನ್ಯಾಚುರಲಿ ಎಕ್ಸ್ಟ್ರಾಕ್ಟ್ ಮಾಡಿದ್ರೆ, ಅದು ಯಾವುದೇ ಪ್ರೊಸೆಸ್ ಮಾಡದೇ ಇದ್ರೆ ಅದು ಫ್ರೂಟ್ ಜ್ಯೂಸ್ ಅಲ್ಲ. It was held that description fruit juices as occurring therein should be construed in the context of preceding words, and that orange juice unsweetened and freshly pressed out was not within the description ಅಂತ ಜಡ್ಜ್ಮೆಂಟ್ ಕೊಟ್ಟಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಹಾಗಾಗಿ ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಫ್ರೂಟ್ ಜ್ಯೂಸ್ ಅನ್ನು ನಾನು ಮ್ಯಾನುಫ್ಯಾಕ್ಚರ್ಡ್ ಬ್ಯಾವರೇಜ್ ಅಂತ ಕನ್ಸಿಡರ್ ಆಗಬೇಕಾದ್ರೆ ಫ್ರೆಶ್ಲಿ ಎಕ್ಸ್ಟ್ರಾಕ್ಟ್ ಮಾಡಿದ ಫ್ರೂಟ್ ಜ್ಯೂಸ್ ಕನ್ಸಿಡರ್ ಆಗುದಿಲ್ಲ. ಫ್ರೆಶ್ಲಿ ಎಕ್ಸ್ಟ್ರಾಕ್ಟೆಡ್ ಫ್ರೂಟ್ ಜ್ಯೂಸ್ ವಿಲ್ ನಾಟ್ ಬಿ ಕನ್ಸಿಡರ್ಡ್. Similarly, private dispensary of a hot doctor is not a commercial establishment. Commercial establishment means an establishment which carries on business, trade, profession. 3 ವರ್ಡ್ ಇದೆ: ಬಿಸ್ನೆಸ್, ಟ್ರೇಡ್, ಪ್ರೊಫೆಷನ್. ಬಿಸ್ನೆಸ್ ಬೇರೆ, ಟ್ರೇಡ್ ಬೇರೆ, ಪ್ರೊಫೆಷನ್ ಬೇರೆ. ಆದ್ರೆ ಮೀನಿಂಗ್ ಎಲ್ಲಿಂದ ತೆಗಿಬೇಕು? ಆದ್ರೆ ಈಚ್ ಅದರ್ಸ್ ಅಸೋಸಿಯೇಷನ್ ಅಂತ ತೆಗಿಬೇಕು. ಬಿಸ್ನೆಸ್, ಟ್ರೇಡ್, ಪ್ರೊಫೆಷನ್ ಮೂರನ್ನು ಒಟ್ಟಿಗೆ ಯೂಸ್ ಮಾಡುವಾಗ ವಾಟ್ ಡಸ್ ಇಟ್ ಸಿಗ್ನಿಫೈ? ಇಟ್ ಸಿಗ್ನಿಫೈಸ್ ದಟ್ ಸಮ್ ಕಮರ್ಷಿಯಲ್ ಆಕ್ಟಿವಿಟಿ, ಯಾವುದೋ ರೀತಿಯ ದುಡ್ಡು ಮಾಡುವ ಆಕ್ಟಿವಿಟಿ ಆಗಿರುವಾಗ, ಒಬ್ಬ ಡಾಕ್ಟರ್ನ ಕ್ಲಿನಿಕ್ ಇದ್ರೆ ಆ ಕ್ಲಿನಿಕ್ ಅನ್ನು ನಾನು ಕಮರ್ಷಿಯಲ್ ಎಸ್ಟಾಬ್ಲಿಷ್ಮೆಂಟ್ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಲಿಕ್ಕೆ ಆಗುದಿಲ್ಲ. ಯಾಕೆ? even though you are doing a profession there, it will not be considered as a commercial establishment, because here profession means money making profession, whereas doctor clinic is not there to make money, rather it is there to give service. That is the intention of the lawmaker. Next, rule of contemporana expositio. What does this say? Statute or a document is to be interpreted by referring to the exposition it received from contemporary. We normally give a good example for this in case of contract act, communication of offer, communication of acceptance. ಯಾವಾಗ ಅರ್ಥ ಮಾಡ್ಕೊಳ್ಬೇಕು? ಆಕ್ಟ್ ಯಾವಾಗ ಮಾಡಿದ್ರು, ಹೇಗೆ ಮಾಡಿದ್ರು, ಅದರ ಕಂಟೆಕ್ಸ್ಟ್ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಅರ್ಥ ಮಾಡ್ಕೊಳ್ಬೇಕು. ದಟ್ ಇಸ್ ವಾಟ್ ಇಟ್ ಸೇಸ್. The maxim custom is the best interpreter of the law. Thus, court was influenced in by the fact that it was that which okay, I hope I am audible. One second. Yeah. But remember that this maxim is to be applied for construing ancient statutes, but not to acts that are comparatively modern. Modern context ಗಳಿಗಲ್ಲ, ಏನ್ಸಿಯಂಟ್ ಸ್ಟ್ಯಾಟ್ಯೂಟ್ಸ್ ಗಳನ್ನು ಓದ್ಲಿಕ್ಕೆ ಮಾತ್ರ ಇದನ್ನು ಅಪ್ಲೈ ಮಾಡಬೇಕು. ಕಂಟೆಂಪರನ ಎಕ್ಸ್ಪೋಸಿಟೋ ಓನ್ಲಿ ಫಾರ್ ಕಾಂಟೆಂಪರರಿ ಆಕ್ಟ್ ಆರ್ ಏನ್ಸಿಯಂಟ್ ಆಕ್ಟ್ ಗಳನ್ನು ಕನ್ಸ್ಟ್ರೂ ಮಾಡ್ಲಿಕ್ಕೆ ಮಾತ್ರ ಇದನ್ನು ಅಪ್ಲೈ ಮಾಡಬೇಕು. ದಿಸ್ ಇಸ್ ವಾಟ್ ಇಸ್ ಕಂಟೆಂಪರೋನಿಯಾ ಎಕ್ಸ್ಪೋಸಿಟೋ. ಕಂಟೆಂಪರೋನಿಯಾ ಎಕ್ಸ್ಪೋಸಿಟೋ. So with this, we conclude secondary rules of interpretation also. Secondary rules of interpretation kuda mugitide illige. As the last part of the discussion, what I want to cover here is this part of rules of interpreting or construing of deeds or documents. Hardly tested area, but still we have to remember certain important points here also. Rules of interpretation or construction of deeds and documents. What are the things that must be kept in mind? See, first one is there. The first and foremost point that one has to bear in mind is that one has to find out what a reasonable man would understand by the words used in the deed or document. You ignore all these things. The first and foremost point, while understanding deeds or documents, what you have to keep in mind is that one has to find out what a reasonable man would understand by the words used in that. ನಾರ್ಮಲ್ ಪರ್ಸನ್ ಹೇಗೆ ಅರ್ಥ ಮಾಡ್ಕೊಳ್ತಾನೆ ಅದನ್ನು ನಾವು ನೋಡಬೇಕು. ನಾರ್ಮಲ್ ಪರ್ಸನ್ ಹೇಗೆ ನೋಡ್ತಾನೆ ಅದನ್ನು ನಾವು ನೋಡ್ಕೊಳ್ಬೇಕು. ದಿಸ್ ಇಸ್ ವಾಟ್ ಇಟ್ ಸ್ಟೇಟ್ಸ್. The principle of construction in case of document and deed does not differ so much except in some minor details. A deed must be read as a whole in order to ascertain the true meaning of its several clauses, and the words of each clauses should be so interpreted as to bring them in harmony with each other, with other provisions. If that they are naturally suspectable. Endeavor means effort shall be made to find out how a reasonable and well-informed person would understand by the words used in the deed or document. How a person would understand. Well-informed person ಏನ್ ಅರ್ಥ ಮಾಡ್ಕೊಳ್ತಾನೆ ಅದೇ ತರ ನಾವು deed or document ಅನ್ನು ಅರ್ಥ ಮಾಡ್ಕೊಳ್ಬೇಕು. This is what it states. The golden rule of construction is to ascertain the intention of the parties to the instrument after considering all words in their ordinary natural sense. So, this is first point you have to remember. Second one is here. Third one is here. Fourth one, golden rule. It has to be borne in mind that very many words are used in more than one sense, and that sense differs in different circumstances. Even where a particular word has to trained conveyancer a clear and definite significance, and one can be sure about the sense in which such conveyancer would use it. It may not be reasonable and proper to give the same strict interpretation of words when used by one who is not so equally skilled in the art of conveyancing. So the problem is that in case of document, it is drafted by a normal person rather than a lawmaker. ಹಾಗಾಗಿ ಅದನ್ನು expert ಮಾಡಿದ document ಅಂತ ನಾವು consider ಮಾಡ್ಲಿಕ್ಕೆ ಆಗುದಿಲ್ಲ. Then when there is conflict, what it has to do? It is expedient to construe the terms of one deed by reference to the terms of the another. It is an elementary rule of construction that the same word cannot have two different meaning in the same document unless the context compels the adoption of such course. The document must be read as a whole and the intention deduced therefrom as to what actual terms of the parties intend to agree. All these things are not very relevant. You can go to here, this point here. We covered fourth point. We can come to fifth point here. It may also happen that there is a conflict between two or more clauses in the same document. An effort should be made to resolve the conflict by interpreting the clause so that all the clauses are given effect to. If, however, it is not possible to give effect to all of them, then it is the earlier clause that will override the later one. Earlier clause will override the later one, unlike the act. If one part of the document is in conflict with another, an attempt should always be made to read two parts of the document harmoniously if possible. If it is not possible, earlier part will prevail over the later one, which should therefore be disregarded. Earlier part will prevail over the later one. These are the 6 different rules to be kept in mind with respect to interpretation of deeds or documents. So these are the important highlights that you have to remember. External aids and the initial part, I don't feel those are very, very important. Purely from the examination perspective, since we are discussing here, I give importance to these many areas, that to the points that I have specifically asked you to mark. So please make sure that you read only these points specifically and you cover them in a detailed manner with respect to this particular chapter. Better prepare a notes from this material. Whatever we have discussed here from this material, prepare a notes clearly so that you can have key points whenever a question is asked. Make sure that you approach a question from interpretation of statutes. Don't leave it as it is, because as far as my analysis goes, worst case scenario, I'm saying worst case scenario, suppose you are not in a position to write the thing that you are known. ಗೊತ್ತೇ ಇಲ್ಲ ನಿಮಗೆ, ಏನು ಬರೀಲಿ ಗೊತ್ತೇ ಇಲ್ಲ, ಆದ್ರೂ ನೀವು ಅಪ್ರೋಚ್ ಮಾಡ್ತೀರಿ ಅಂತಾದ್ರೆ at least one mark ಆದ್ರೂ ಸಿಗ್ತದೆ. ಇಂಟರ್ಪ್ರಿಟೇಷನ್ ಆಫ್ ಸ್ಟ್ಯಾಟ್ಯೂಟ್ಸ್ ಚಾಪ್ಟರ್ ಇಂದ ನೀವು ಕ್ವಶನ್ ಅಟೆಂಪ್ಟ್ ಮಾಡಿದ್ರೆ ಮಿನಿಮಮ್ 1 ಮಾರ್ಕ್ಸ್ ಆದ್ರೂ ನಿಮಗೆ ಸಿಗ್ತದೆ. ಅಟೆಂಪ್ಟ್ ಮಾಡ್ಬೇಕಷ್ಟೇ. ಅಟೆಂಪ್ಟ್ ಮಾಡಿ ಸ್ವಲ್ಪ ಗೊತ್ತಿರೋ ವಿಷಯಗಳನ್ನು ಬರೀರಿ. As far as I have analyzed the institute's valuation pattern, if a student approaches a question from interpretation of statutes, institute will normally award 1 mark. 1 mark ಅನ್ನಾದ್ರೂ ಕೊಡ್ತದೆ. ಆಗಿರುವಾಗ ಅನ್ನೆಸೆಸರಿಲಿ ಈ ಗೊತ್ತಿಲ್ಲದನ್ನೆಲ್ಲ ಬರೆಯೋ ಬದಲಿಗೆ or ಇದನ್ನು ಸುಮ್ಮನೆ ಬಿಟ್ಟು ಬಿಡುವ ಬದಲಿಗೆ you approach this question in your answer paper so that at least 1 mark will be assured for you. ಇಲ್ಲ ನಿಮಗೆ ಹಾರ್ಡ್ಲಿ ಇದರಲ್ಲಿ ಜಾಸ್ತಿ ಪ್ರಾಬ್ಲಮ್ ಏನು, ಒಂದು ಕ್ವಶನ್ ಕೇಳಿದ್ರು 4 ರಿಂದ 5 ಪಾಯಿಂಟ್ಸ್ ಬರೆದ್ರೆ ಆಯ್ತು. ಆ ಸ್ಪೆಸಿಫಿಕ್ ಪಾಯಿಂಟ್ಸ್ ಅನ್ನು ಬರೆದು ಮುಗಿಸಿದ್ರೆ ಟೈಮು ಸೇವ್ ಆಗ್ತದೆ, ಈಚೆಯಿಂದ ಮಾರ್ಕ್ಸ್ ಕೂಡ ಬಂದೇ ಬರ್ತದೆ. ಆಗಿರುವಾಗ ಪ್ಲೀಸ್ ಸ್ಟಿಕ್ ಟು ದ ಇನ್ಸ್ಟಿಟ್ಯೂಟ್ ಮೆಟೀರಿಯಲ್. ಅನ್ನೆಸೆಸರಿಲಿ ಯಾವುದನ್ನು ರೆಫರ್ ಮಾಡ್ಲಿಕ್ಕೆ ಹೋಗಬೇಡಿ. ಸ್ಟಿಕ್ ಟು ಇನ್ಸ್ಟಿಟ್ಯೂಟ್ ಮೆಟೀರಿಯಲ್, ರೀಡ್ ಇನ್ಸ್ಟಿಟ್ಯೂಟ್ ಮೆಟೀರಿಯಲ್ ಅಂಡ್ ರೈಟ್ ಅಕಾರ್ಡಿಂಗ್ ಟು ದ ಪ್ರೊವಿಷನ್ಸ್ ಗಿವನ್ ಇನ್ ದ ಇನ್ಸ್ಟಿಟ್ಯೂಟ್ ಮೆಟೀರಿಯಲ್ ಕ್ಲಿಯರ್ಲಿ. ಮೋರ್ ದನ್ ಸಫಿಷಿಯಂಟ್ ಫಾರ್ ದಿಸ್ ಪರ್ಟಿಕ್ಯುಲರ್ ಪಾರ್ಟ್. So on that note, I will wind up this particular session for today. In tomorrow's session, I'll meet you back again with discussion on General Clauses Act, and I'll be completing the General Clauses Act discussion in the tomorrow's session. Then we can go for Foreign Exchange Management Act on Sunday, as per our schedule. So for today, I'll wind up the session here. Please make sure that you use your time efficiently so that you prepare well for your examination. Make sure that if it is possible, you complete this entire discussion in today's session only. And so that for tomorrow's session, General Clauses Act, we can have a fruitful discussion, that too purely based on the examination part. I'm not going to do complete General Clauses Act. Examination perspective, whatever is important, I'll cover it in the tomorrow's session. So on that note, we'll end the session here for today. Thank you. Take care. Have a good day. Tomorrow's class will be on General Clauses Act. Tomorrow's discussion will be on General Clauses Act. So for today, thank you. Take care. Good night.